They said I could sit in the garage just for a little while until the guests were gone and the photographs were taken. And I remember the exact sound of my son's voice when he said it, smooth and practical, as if he were asking me to pass the salt. But underneath there was something clipped, something careful, like he was trying to keep the words neat so they wouldn't spill and reveal what they really meant, which was that I was an inconvenience, a blemish on the perfect picture of their curated lives. And in that moment, I felt myself shrink into the kind of silence that comes only after decades of learning to make yourself small in the houses you've helped pay for, but no longer belong to. I am 81 years old, and I live alone now, in a place where no one tells me where to sit or what to wear or how to smile. But it wasn't always this way, and the road from that night in the garage to the chair where I sit today was paved not with kindness or recognition, but with humiliation, with being told to lower my voice, to stay out of photographs, to keep my presence muted like wallpaper that fades behind expensive furniture. And if I sound calm as I tell it now, it is only because I have carried the weight of it long enough that it no longer trembles in my hands. It simply rests there like a stone polished smooth by time. That night, when David leaned close and said, "Mom, just for now, stay here. The neighbors are inside and it'll be simpler." I didn't argue. I never argued. I just nodded and smiled like someone who doesn't want to ruin the mood. But my ears caught Sophie's laugh from the kitchen, bright and brittle, and one of the children's voices saying something like, "Grandma's here for her free dinner," again, and the others giggling because cruelty comes easily to the young when they see it modeled by the adults they adore. And I thought to myself how strange it is that a woman can raise a boy, feed him, clothe him, sit by his bed when he's sick, and then one day he grows up and treats her like a stray cat that wandered in from the street and needs to be hidden before the guests arrive. I sat on an old folding chair by the bicycles and the lawnmower, and the garage smelled of gasoline and damp cardboard, and I folded my hands in my lap, steady, patient, remembering the thousands of dinners I had cooked, the birthday parties I had planned, the mortgage payments I had helped cover, and wondering how all of that could dissolve so completely into this moment where I was told to wait out of sight like an unwanted delivery. The part that lodged in me deepest wasn't even the garage itself, but the casualness with which it was said, as though it were obvious, as though this was the natural order of things, as though old women who have outlived their usefulness must simply step aside and make space for the ones who still shine. And I realized that in his world, in Sophie's world, my existence had been reduced to a kind of shadow that should be managed, hidden, adjusted according to the lighting, so that no one saw the wrinkles, the old cardigans, the reminders of what it costs to live long enough to be discarded. I remember trying to take a slow breath, not to cry, not even to rage, because tears would have been an indulgence and rage would have been dismissed as senility. So I simply pressed my lips together and watched the crack of light beneath the garage door, thinking about how many times in my life I had been asked to wait, to endure, to hold steady, and how this waiting felt different, heavier, because this wasn't waiting for a train or for a doctor or for a call. This was waiting for permission to exist. It is important to say that I was not poor, not really, though they like to call me that. To joke about how mom's broke, she still counts her pennies, as if frugality were a curse, as if carefulness were shameful. But I had enough. I always had. Enough. And the irony was that much of what they flaunted, the big house, the trips, the perfect photographs, had been made possible by the quiet contributions I gave over the years, money from my savings, from my late husband's life insurance, from the trust I never spoke about. And I never asked for credit, never asked for recognition, only for a seat at the table, a place in the picture. But even that turned out to be too much. I had grown accustomed to invisibility in small doses, the way they forgot to mention me in stories, the way Sophie introduced me as David's mom, visiting from out of town, rather than by my name, the way birthdays came and went with perfunctory phone calls. But the garage was something else. The garage was a declaration, a final underlining of the fact that in their story, I was not a character, not even a footnote, just an obstacle to be managed. I should tell you who I was before all of this, before I became the old woman in the garage. I was a nurse for 40 years, the kind of nurse who remembered patients' names and their children's birthdays, the kind of nurse who stayed late to hold someone's hand when their family didn't show up, the kind of nurse who could stretch a paycheck until it screamed, but still found a way to make sure her son had new shoes for school. And when my husband died, I kept going, kept working, kept saving. Because I believed in a future where sacrifice would turn into security, where love given would be love returned. I believed that when David grew older, when he had his own family, he would remember the smell of the casseroles I baked, the nights I sat up with him through fevers, the way I clapped at his high school graduation louder than anyone, and that, remembering, would shape him into a man who carried me with pride. But what I didn't understand was that some children grow not by honoring their roots, but by cutting them off to pretend they grew taller on their own. So there I was, in the garage, the faint hum of voices and music drifting from the living room, the sound of glasses clinking, of laughter that did not include me. And I thought to myself, this is how they want me to be remembered, not as a woman, not as a mother, not as someone who built anything, but as a figure pressed into the background, silent, compliant, out of view. And yet, even as that thought weighed on me, there was another thought rising, a quieter one that had been dormant for years. The thought that maybe, just maybe, there was still something left for me to do. Some act not of vengeance, but of reclamation, some way to remind both them and myself that I was not a shadow, not an afterthought, not a guest in the life I helped build. I did not know then exactly what shape that act would take, but I knew that the humiliation I felt sitting on that folding chair was not the end of my story, only the opening sentence. That is how this begins, with me in a garage smelling of oil and dust, listening to my family laugh without me, tasting the metallic sting of being called broke, when in truth I had been the silent benefactor all along, and realizing in that bitter silence that invisibility is not always forced upon you. Sometimes it is something you allow, and that night I understood I would no longer allow it. It was the next morning, when the house had gone quiet after the echoes of their party, that the truth settled like dust in my lungs, heavy and impossible to ignore, because sometimes Betrayal does not come as a loud announcement, but as a small, almost invisible moment that clarifies everything at once. And for me, that moment arrived when I saw the stack of envelopes on the kitchen counter. Mail that had been left unopened, bills and notices that should have been hidden away from guests, and among them, one lay face up. A letter from the mortgage company with a red stamp I recognized from my years of working with patients who often fell behind on payments. The mark that meant warnings had already been sent, that patients had already run out. I didn't touch it, not then. I only let my eyes rest on the word delinquent, printed in merciless black, and I thought of the way they had laughed the night before, the way they had nudged each other about my so-called poverty, and the irony of it washed over me like cold water. Because the truth was I had been careful. I had always been careful, and they had been reckless, all shine on the outside and hollow in the center. And I knew, in a way I had not known before, that their mockery was not born of strength but of fear, of a fragile life balanced on borrowed money and borrowed pride. When David came into the kitchen, his shirt unbuttoned at the collar, his hair slightly mussed from sleep, he seemed younger for a moment, like the boy who used to shuffle into my bedroom asking for one more story before bed, and for a fleeting second I almost forgot the garage, almost forgot the laughter, almost forgot the way Sophie's voice had curled with dismissal when she said, "She can. Stay out there. No one will notice." But then he opened the refrigerator, pulled out a bottle of green juice, and without even glancing at me said, "You don't mind keeping an eye on the baby today, do you? Sophie's got errands, and I've got calls." And just like that, I was reminded of my station in their world. Not a guest, not a mother, not a woman with her own life, but a placeholder, a caretaker, a background figure to be summoned when convenient. I said nothing at first, only nodded, because silence was easier. Silence had become my armor. But as he left the room, his phone pressed to his ear, I found myself looking again at the envelope on the counter, at the stamp, at the proof that everything they pretended to own was already slipping from their grasp. And in that moment, something in me shifted. I carried the baby for a while, the little girl with Sophie's sharp chin and David's restless eyes. And as I held her, I felt the familiar ache of love that refuses to die. The love that comes from blood and history. The love that lingers even after betrayal. And I whispered to her, not words of bitterness, but words of truth. You don't know it yet, but everything they tell you about strength and beauty will one day fall apart. And you'll have to find something deeper, something no one can take from you, she gurgled, her small hand catching at the chain around my neck. And I thought of how easily a child's innocence can be used as a shield, how Sophie liked to parade the baby in front of neighbors as proof of a perfect life, while behind the curtain, the cracks widened every day. Later, when I went for a walk, I passed the real estate office at the corner of the boulevard, its windows lined with glossy photographs of houses with trimmed lawns and smiling families. And I paused, not because I wanted one of those photographs, but because I saw, taped discreetly to the side, a notice for an upcoming auction. And the address printed there was theirs, David's house, the one I had been exiled from in every possible way. At first I thought it was a mistake, an error, some administrative fluke. But then I remembered the envelope, the red stamp, the way David's eyes had darted away when I had asked once, months ago, how the mortgage was going, and he had said, 2. Quickly, "It's fine, Mom. Don't worry about it. Just enjoy your retirement." And I realized it had never been fine, not from the beginning. He had needed me then, needed my credit, needed my savings for the down payment, and I had given it without hesitation, because mothers do that. Because I believed his promises that it was just paperwork, that it was temporary, that I was helping him secure a future for his children. What I had really secured was his illusion, and now that illusion was crumbling. I stood outside that office for a long time, watching the reflection of my own face in the glass, lined and tired but steady. And I thought about how long I had lived on other people's terms, how many times I had been told to wait, to sit, to be quiet, to not embarrass anyone. And I realized that this foreclosure notice was not just their crisis. It was my opportunity, a door opening in a wall I had thought was permanent. I did not decide right then, not fully, but something settled in me, a certainty that I would not simply watch from the sidelines this time. I would act. I would step into the story instead of being pushed to the margins of it. When I returned to the house, Sophie was on the phone, her voice pitched high with false cheer, saying things like, "Oh, we're doing so well. The neighborhood has been so welcoming. We're really thriving here." And I thought of the way her eyes had narrowed the night before when she caught me lingering near the living room door, the way she had herded me back toward the garage as if I were a stray dog. She looked up briefly, offered me a distracted smile, then turned her back, and it was in that turning away that I saw clearly what I had been refusing to admit. They would never invite me in. Not really. Not into their lives. Not into their hearts. Not even into their home. Not unless it served their image. Not unless it made them look generous or successful. And I understood, with a kind of calm that was almost frightening, that if I wanted a place, I would have to take it. That night I lay in the cold guest bed, the sheets stiff, and the air humming with the sound of the central system that never seemed to rest. And I closed my eyes not to sleep, but to imagine. I imagined walking into that real estate office, imagined signing papers with my name in steady ink, imagined standing in the doorway of that house not as a guest, not as a burden, not as a hidden shame, but as the owner, the one with the deed in her hand. The thought did not make me giddy. It did not even make me angry. It simply made me certain as I had ever been about anything, that the years of waiting were over. And so the catalyst was not a fight, not a dramatic confrontation, not even an insult shouted in anger, but something quieter, sharper, more devastating. The discovery that the house they had excluded me from was already slipping through their fingers, and the realization that I, the woman they mocked for being broke, was the only one who still had the means and the resolve to claim it. It was the red stamp on the envelope, the auction notice on the glass, the whispered command to stay out of sight, all of it combining into one truth I could no longer ignore. They thought they had hidden me, but in hiding me, they had freed me, and in freeing me, they had given me the one thing they never expected, the chance to act not as their mother, not as their guest, but as myself. When the first envelope arrived in their mailbox with the bank's return address printed in stern black letters, I saw David fold it quickly and slip it into the drawer of the console table, his face arranged into that careful neutrality he had practiced since he was a boy trying to hide poor report cards. And I knew then that the crisis was moving closer, not in loud thunder, but in the quiet drip of inevitability. I said nothing, because silence had always been my most reliable disguise. But my eyes missed nothing. Not the way Sophie tightened her jaw when she checked her phone. Not the way David poured another drink before dinner. Not the way the laughter at the table had grown brittle, every chuckle edged with the awareness that their beautiful life was leaking at the seams. They still called me broke when they thought it was funny, still whispered to one another about how I was lucky to have them to look after me. But I noticed how the fridge had fewer fresh items, how the wine shifted from imported to domestic, how Sophie started wearing old dresses disguised as vintage. Their collapse was quiet, but it was happening, and I sat in the middle of it, invisible and necessary, the one they asked to babysit, to fold laundry, to run small errands, but never to sit at the head of the table, never to speak when company was present. It was during those weeks that I began to take long walks, not because the neighborhood called to me, but because distance steadied my mind. I walked past rows of identical houses, manicured lawns trimmed to identical heights, and thought about how carefully people cultivate appearances, how desperate they are to hide the cracks. And I thought too about the cracks in my own life, the ways I had allowed myself to be folded into silence, told to wait in garages and spare rooms, to pretend that my presence was optional. It was on one of those walks that I began to carry a small notebook in my pocket, the kind with lined pages and a spiral binding. And into it, I wrote not confessions, but observations. Notes about the way David clenched his jaw when Sophie mentioned money, the way the children laughed too easily when she mocked me, the way neighbors' eyes lingered too long when they passed the driveway, sensing something was not right but unwilling to name it. It was not anger that drove me to write, but clarity, a sharpening of the truth I had long buried. That I had been living as a guest in a life I had helped fund, and that if I continued to remain silent, I would die in that role, remembered only as the old woman in the background of photographs, if remembered at all. At night, in the guest room, I would unfold the copy of the deed I had kept hidden all those years. The original document with both our names printed on it, mine first, his second, and I would run my finger over the letters, not as proof of ownership, but as proof of existence, as proof that I had not imagined my place, that once, when he needed me, when he could not stand alone, I was the one who had given him the foundation. And I thought about how quickly that foundation had been forgotten, how easily my sacrifices had been rewritten into weakness, how my frugality had become a joke, how my quietness had been mistaken for emptiness. The more I stared at that paper, the steadier my resolve became, not in a burst of fury, but in the calm of someone who has carried enough weight to know when to stop carrying it. There was a day when Sophie staged one of her small performances, inviting a neighbor for coffee and guiding her through the pristine living room with its curated artwork and empty warmth. And when the neighbor asked, with innocent curiosity, who I was, Sophie smiled that sharp smile and said, "Oh, that's just Mary, David's mother. She's visiting. She doesn't live here. She's between places right now, but we're taking care of her." And the neighbor's expression softened into pity, and I felt the burn of it, not because of what Sophie had said, but because of what she had erased. Between places, as though I were a suitcase, as though I had never held a key, never built a home, never stood on my own. I poured the neighbor her coffee without comment. But inside me, something began to pulse, a steady reminder that this erasure would only continue if I allowed it. The escalation did not come as a single explosion, but as a slow tightening. Each day another notch turned, each slight another reminder. I watched as David avoided the phone calls from unknown numbers, as Sophie checked the calendar with a furrowed brow, as the children picked up on the tension and grew restless. And all the while, they still dismissed me, still laughed at my old shoes, still asked why I brought my own groceries when there's plenty here, though we all knew there wasn't. And I began to prepare, not with rage but with method, making inquiries at the bank under the guise of harmless curiosity, visiting the real estate office with the air of someone interested in the market, pulling from the quiet reserves I had kept, hidden for decades, the accounts David never knew about, the careful sums built from years of working, saving, denying myself luxuries, so that one day there would be something left. The first time I met with the agent, I felt an odd calm, as though I were not stepping into battle, but into inevitability. The woman behind the desk asked me if I was looking to downsize, and I nearly laughed, because what I was doing was not downsizing, it was reclaiming. It was taking back what had been taken from me not by theft, but by dismissal, by the casual cruelty of being told to wait outside. I told her I was interested in upcoming auctions, that I liked to keep an eye on properties in this neighborhood, and she nodded politely, not knowing that the house she pointed to, the one she said might be on the block soon, was the very house from which I had been erased. I left her office with a packet of information tucked into my bag, my hands steady, my heart slow, because for the first time in years I felt not like a relic, but like a woman at the beginning of something. At home that night, I listened to David and Sophie argue in hushed tones behind their bedroom door. Words like late fee and second notice slipping through. And I sat in the guest room with the packet on my lap, the pages whispering of possibility, and I thought about how escalation often feels from the inside, not like fire, but like pressure, like air growing heavy before a storm. And I realized that this was the beginning of mine. They thought I was passive, that I would endure endlessly, that my silence meant surrender. But my silence had been gathering weight, and now it was shifting into action. I began to imagine the look on David's face when he realized, the disbelief in Sophie's eyes when she understood, the moment when the laughter about my supposed poverty would collapse into the truth that I had been the only one with enough left to hold steady. And so the first escalation was not a confrontation at all, but the quiet preparation, the walks, the notebook, the deed, the packet of auction listings, the steady gathering of resolve. It was the moment when I stopped being only the woman in the garage and began to be the woman with a plan. The woman who knew that the same hands that had been mocked for counting pennies were about to count something far greater, something no one could dismiss. The shift came quietly, not as a thunderclap, but as a soft turning inside me. The kind of change you do not notice until you realize you are walking differently, breathing differently, seeing with eyes that have stopped waiting for permission. I had spent weeks observing the cracks in their carefully staged life, carrying my small notebook like a talisman, filling its pages with details that steadied me more than they accused them, because I no longer needed proof of their hypocrisy. I needed proof that I was awake, that I was no longer a figure sitting obediently in the garage waiting to be summoned. One afternoon, I walked back to the real estate office, the sun sharp on the pavement, the air heavy with the scent of cut grass, and I felt the strangest calmness, as if each step were carrying me further from the role they had assigned me and closer to the one I was about to claim. The agent, a brisk woman with silver hair and kind eyes that did not pry, recognized me at once and said she had a file ready. She slid the folder across the desk, her nails tapping lightly against the manila surface, and inside were the auction details, the reserve price, the timeline, the dates. My name would not appear yet, not until the papers were signed, but in that moment I felt the weight of the decision settle into my bones. I was no longer waiting. I was moving. I returned to the house not as a guest, but as someone holding a secret. And the secret was not only about money or ownership, but about choice. About the fact that for the first time in decades, I was choosing something not for David, not for Sophie, not for the grandchildren who barely looked up from their screens, but for myself. I made dinner that evening as they argued in low tones in the next room, slicing vegetables with steady hands, listening not to the words, but to the rhythm of their voices, the growing panic they tried to disguise. When Sophie entered the kitchen, she gave me a thin smile and said she hoped I wasn't tired, that I really shouldn't overexert myself, and I wanted to laugh at the irony of it, because she thought I was fragile. She thought I was fading, when in truth I had not felt so alive in years. I stirred the pot and said nothing, but inside I was smiling at the image of myself, not as a burden, but as a woman who held the deed in her future hand. At night, I began to plan with a quiet precision, reviewing my old accounts, the investments I had almost forgotten about, the small trust my husband had left me, the one I had never touched because I believed it should be kept for family. Emergencies, and I realized with a clarity that startled me that this was the emergency, not the foreclosure itself, but the erasure, the casual cruelty, the rewriting of my life into a story where I was nothing but an afterthought. I made lists in the margins of my notebook, lists of what I would need, whom I might call for advice, how I would structure the purchase. It was not revenge that guided my pen, but a slow blooming of agency, the recognition that I had always been capable, but had long been persuaded to forget. I remembered myself at 25, keeping books for a doctor's office, balancing numbers with ease, never making a mistake, and I thought, she is still here, the woman who knew how to manage, the woman who knew how to survive. The midpoint of my story was not a confrontation with David or Sophie, but a conversation with myself, a breaking of the silence I had kept even in my own head. One evening, I stood in front of the bathroom mirror, the harsh light falling across the lines of my face, and I whispered aloud, "You are not broken. You are not invisible. You are not poor." And though my voice cracked on the last word, it steadied. By the end, and I believed it, that small act of speaking was more radical than shouting at them could ever have been, because it shifted the ground beneath me, reminding me that I was not a ghost haunting their house, but a woman preparing to claim her own ground. I tested the new strength in small ways. When Sophie suggested I might wear a lighter cardigan to dinner, I shook my head and kept my navy dress. When David asked if I could move my things to the smaller closet, I told him I preferred where they were. These were not battles, but symbols, proof that I no longer bent automatically, no longer swallowed every dismissal. I saw the flicker of confusion in their eyes, the brief hesitation when they realized I was no longer so easy to manage, and it gave me a quiet satisfaction, not triumph, but affirmation. The balance was shifting, And though they could not yet see it, I could. There was one evening, late, when I stepped outside into the cool air, the streetlights humming faintly, and I looked at the house from the sidewalk as though I were a stranger passing by. From the outside, it looked like every other house on the block, perfect and hollow. But I knew that soon it would be mine, in a way it had never been theirs. Not because of money, but because of choice. Because I would hold it not as a stage set for appearances, but as a reclamation of dignity. I closed my eyes and let the night breeze wash over me. And for the first time in years, I felt not like a burden, but like a beginning. And so the midpoint of my journey was not dramatic or loud, but quietly transformative, a turning of the inner dial, the moment when I stopped asking, stopped waiting, stopped shrinking, and began to act as though my life belonged to me again. They still mocked, they still dismissed, they still called me broke with careless laughter, but their words no longer rooted in me, no longer cut as they once had, because I had already shifted, already chosen my path. The woman in the garage was gone. In her place stood someone who remembered her own strength, someone who would no longer wait to be invited in. It was after I had made peace with my decision, after the quiet nights of planning and the whispered affirmations to my reflection, that the past, as it always does, found a way to knock at my door, testing the new strength I had only just begun to trust. The first test came in the form of a letter slipped under the guest room door one morning, not with ceremony, but with a kind of casual dismissal, as if they assumed I would be grateful for any scrap of attention. The handwriting on the envelope was clumsy, eager, and when I opened it, I recognized at once the uneven strokes of my eldest grandson. "Grandma, I miss you," the note began, only a few lines, awkward but genuine, written without Sophie's polished control or David's clipped tone. He said he didn't understand why I was never in the family pictures anymore, that he wished I could come to more of his soccer games, that things felt different when I wasn't around. I sat on the bed with the letter trembling in my hands, not because it hurt, but because it softened me, reminded me that beneath all the layers of performance and cruelty, there were still innocent hearts tethered to mine. I folded it carefully, placed it in the drawer beside the deed copy, and whispered to myself that he would be the only one I might allow back into my life when the time came. But letters were followed by other kinds of messages, ones less tender, less innocent. Sophie began leaving brochures on the counter, pamphlets for senior living communities, with glossy photographs of cheerful women playing cards in pastel-colored rooms, their smiles stretched thin over the caption, "Because they deserve the best." She never mentioned them aloud, but her meaning was clear. David, too, began to shift his tone, his voice carrying that edge of forced patience when he asked me to lower my voice at dinner, to keep my comments short when guests were present, to remember that not everything needs to be about you, Mom. Each time I nodded, outwardly compliant. But inside I felt the slow burn of resolve growing hotter, because I knew that beneath his control lay fear, the fear that I had seen too much, that I might speak too loudly about the truth they were hiding. The missed payments, the looming auction, the fragile shell of their perfect life. The second escalation revealed itself not in one grand betrayal, but in a series of pressures applied carefully, like screws tightening. One evening, after the children had gone to bed, I overheard Sophie on the phone in the kitchen, her voice sharp with urgency as she said, "We have to keep her quiet. If she starts telling people about the deed, about the money. It'll ruin everything." She did not say my name, but she did not need to. I stood in the hallway, my hand resting lightly against the wall, and I felt the chill of recognition. They were not only dismissing me, they were plotting to erase me fully, to manage me into silence as one manages an inconvenient detail in a business deal. I returned to my room without a word, sat on the bed, and opened my notebook, writing slowly. They think I am their problem. Soon, I will be their solution. When the official notice of the auction date arrived, delivered in a plain envelope that David tried to intercept before I saw it, I felt no triumph, only confirmation. He muttered something about a mistake, about clerical errors, about how he was already handling it, but his hands shook as he folded the paper, and I saw the sweat on his brow. Sophie's eyes darted to mine, searching for a reaction, but I gave her none. Inside, though, I was already counting days, already preparing myself for the moment when my silence would break open into action. That night, lying in the stiff bed, I pictured myself at the courthouse, my name signed with deliberate care, the papers stamped and sealed, and I felt a strange kind of peace, the peace of inevitability. But the past does not let go easily. A week before the auction, Sophie came to my room, her smile brittle, carrying a tray of tea she had never before bothered to bring. She set it down and sat beside me, her hand brushing mine in a gesture meant to mimic tenderness, and she said, "We've been under a lot of stress, Mary. I hope you understand. We want the best for you. We want to make sure you're taken care of." Her words dripped with condescension, every syllable wrapped in the suggestion that I was fragile, incompetent, incapable of making decisions on my own. I let her finish, let her perform, and then I looked her in the eye, steady, calm, and said, "I have always taken care of myself." She blinked, her mask slipping for a moment, revealing the small flicker of fear she tried so hard to conceal. She left quickly, the tea untouched, and I knew then that they sensed the shift, even if they could not name it. The escalation reached its sharpest edge when David confronted me directly, late one evening after Sophie had gone upstairs. He stood in the doorway of the guest room, his shoulders tense, his voice low but tight as he said, "Mom, I need you to trust me. Everything is going to be fine. Don't go talking to anyone about the house. Don't confuse the kids. Just stay out of it." For the first time, I did not nod. I did not smile. I looked at him, my son, the boy I had raised, the man who now spoke to me like an obstacle. And I said, "I will never stay out of my own life again." His face paled, his mouth opened to argue, but he said nothing, only turned and left. And I lay, back on the bed with my heart beating steady, no longer afraid of his disapproval. In the days that followed, small confrontations continued to test me. A neighbor stopped me on the sidewalk and asked if everything was all right, because she had seen me walking so often, looking so thoughtful. And before I could answer, Sophie appeared, her arm looping through mine, her voice bright as she said, "Oh, she's just enjoying her retirement. We keep her busy, don't we?" I smiled politely but said nothing, because I knew that soon, very soon, her words would mean nothing. Another time, one of the children asked me why I didn't live in my own house, why I didn't have my own space, and before I could answer, David cut in sharply. "Grandma likes it here," his voice too quick. too defensive. The child looked at me with confusion, and I only smiled. But inside I thought, not for long. The second escalation was not just their pressure on me, but my quiet refusal to bend. I stopped shrinking from their dismissals, stopped excusing their cruelty, stopped believing that silence was safety. I began to write not only notes but letters, drafts of what I would one day send, letters to the lawyer I would hire, to the court, to the future tenants I might choose. I walked with my head higher, not in arrogance but in readiness, carrying the knowledge that soon the balance would shift, that the woman they thought was broke and powerless would be the one holding the key. And as the auction date approached, their desperation grew. I heard Sophie crying in the kitchen one night, muffling her sobs, and David's voice tight with anger as he said, "She can't know, she can't interfere. We'll fix it, we'll make it work." But I already knew, and I was already interfering, though not in the way they feared. I was not sabotaging them. I was saving myself. I was preparing to step fully into the life they had tried to erase, to take back not just a house, but a sense of belonging, a sense of worth, a sense of self. The second escalation was the return of the past in all its forms, the pleading letters, the staged kindness, the veiled threats, the direct confrontation, and my choice, each time, to remain steady, to refuse their script, to prepare for my own. It was the storm before the breaking, the tightening of the screws, the final test of whether I would remain silent or rise. And I chose, with each small act, to rise. The morning I decided to act came with no special omen, no thunder, no warning in the sky, only the same gray light filtering through my curtains and the same ache in my hips as I swung my legs out of bed. But inside me, something had settled. The restless rehearsals of what if had quieted into certainty, and I knew that waiting any longer would be another kind of death, the slow death of becoming irrelevant by my own consent. So I rose, washed my face, dressed in the navy blazer and polished, shoes I had kept ready like a soldier preparing for battle. And as I fastened the simple pearl earrings my husband had once given me, I whispered to my reflection, not with doubt, but with clarity, "Today, you will remind them who you are." I drove to the office with steady hands, the folder of documents resting on the passenger seat like a silent ally. And as the building came into view, I felt no trembling, only the quiet strength of inevitability. When I entered, staff looked up from their desks, their eyes widening slightly, because I was not the woman who had been shrinking in corners these past months. I was upright, deliberate, moving with the calm authority of someone who belonged. I asked the receptionist to call an all-hands meeting in the main conference room, her mouth falling open slightly at my tone, and though she hesitated, the weight in my voice carried no space for refusal. Within half an hour, the room was filled, employees shifting uneasily, whispering, glancing at one another as though trying to guess what was about to happen. My son arrived last, breathless, irritated, his tie askew, demanding to know what was going on. But when he saw me standing at the head of the long table with the folder in front of me, his words faltered, his voice catching on the edge of uncertainty. I let the silence hang, not rushing, because silence itself is power when wielded with intention. Then I opened the folder and laid the documents flat on the table, sliding them toward the center where all could see. "These are the incorporation papers," I said evenly, my voice carrying across the room with the clarity of truth. They show the ownership structure of this company, and they confirm that I am the majority shareholder, the primary voting authority, and the legal backbone upon which every decision must rest. Gasps rippled through the room, and my son's face drained of color as he reached instinctively for the papers, but I placed my hand firmly on them and continued. You have been told a story that this company is the product of one man's vision. That story is incomplete. This company was built with my savings, my signatures, my nights spent balancing accounts, my years of labor when no one else believed in its survival. And as of today, that truth will no longer be hidden. My son stammered, trying to interrupt, insisting that this was unnecessary, that we could discuss it privately. But I held up a hand, and the room quieted again. For months, I have been erased piece by piece, I continued. My name removed from agendas, my desk cleared, my access revoked, as though I were a guest in the house I built. I have been told I am too old to work, too old to contribute, too old to be visible. But let me be very clear, age is not disqualification. It is proof. Proof of endurance, of knowledge carried through decades, of wisdom carved out of failures and victories alike. And today, I am exercising my rightful authority as owner and majority shareholder. Effective immediately, I am assuming the role of interim chief executive officer until a proper governance review is conducted. All major decisions will pass through me. My son will remain in his role, but he will answer to me, as is proper, according to the legal structure you now see before you. The room was utterly still, staff exchanging glances, some nodding almost imperceptibly, others staring at the floor, but I could feel the shift, the weight of truth landing heavily, immovable. My son's jaw tightened, his hands trembling slightly as he tried to gather himself. But the authority he had wielded so easily only days before slipped from his grasp because it had never been absolute. It had only ever been borrowed from the power I had allowed him to use. Now that I had taken it back, he was unmoored, exposed, forced to stand not as sole creator, but as co-participant. I did not raise my voice. I did not gloat. I did not deliver vengeance because true power does not need to shout. I laid out next steps calmly, outlining areas where restructuring would begin, announcing the creation of a mentorship program within the company, an initiative to ensure that experience was valued alongside innovation, that no one would be erased, simply because they had carried years on their shoulders. Staff listened with an attentiveness that had long been absent, because what I was saying was not just about me, it was about all of them, about the culture we would now create together. When I finished, I closed the folder, lifted it into my arms, and looked around the room. I am not too old to work, I said softly but firmly, the words landing like stones dropped into a still pond. I am too experienced to ignore. Then I walked out, the sound of my heels echoing in the corridor, leaving behind a silence that was not emptiness, but recognition. My son followed me into the hallway, his voice breaking as he called after me, first with anger, then with something more fragile. Mom, why are you doing this? Don't you trust me? Don't you want me to succeed? I turned to him, meeting his eyes for the first time in weeks, and said, I want you to succeed, but not at the cost of my erasure. This is not about trust. It is about truth. You cannot build a future on lies, and you cannot build respect on the bones of those who carried you here. You will learn to lead with me, not over me, or you will not lead at all." His mouth opened, then closed, words failing him. And in that silence, I saw not just the boy I had raised, but the man who would now be forced to reckon with the truth of his own arrogance. When I returned to my office, the desk that had been emptied now seemed to wait for me. I placed the folder carefully in the drawer, sat down, and for the first time in months, perhaps years, I felt the solidity of belonging, not as someone tolerated, but as someone who had claimed her place irrevocably. The climax was not in the shouting, not in the confrontation, but in the simple, unassailable act of stepping forward and refusing to be erased. I did not celebrate with noise or ceremony, because when a life turns in your favor, after so many years of being trimmed down to fit other people's frames, the truest celebration is a steady breath that goes all the way to the bottom of your lungs and returns without permission from anyone. So I walked past the mirrors and the curated photographs and the bowls of fruit that were always polished and never eaten, and I stepped outside and let the shy sun find me. And in that quiet, I understood that I would not move into the house I now owned, not because I was afraid of its rooms or ashamed of the power in my name, but because what I wanted was not to conquer their stage set, but to stop performing on it. And that meant choosing a different door, a smaller one with chipped paint, a porch that remembered rain and laughter, a kitchen that forgave messes and burned edges, a place where every chair had been pulled out for a real person and not for a photograph. In the weeks that followed, allowed David and Sophie to remain on a short lease while they gathered themselves, because mercy is not a weakness and boundaries are not cruelty. And I met with a quiet lawyer who did not raise an eyebrow at my age or my calm. And together, we wrote down exactly what would be honored and what would not. And when the time arrived, I handed them a polite letter with dates and signatures and a list of what stayed with the house and what they must carry out with their own hands, including the heavy boxes of blame that were never mine to lift. And on the morning they finally left, carrying the last of their curated vases and their unflattering mirrors, David's eyes met mine, and he opened his mouth to rehearse the old lines about misunderstanding and stress and everyone doing their best, but the script no longer fit, and I was no longer casting. So I only said that I wished his children more truth than style, more kindness than polish, and that I hoped he would teach them to keep a space at the table for the hands that once fed him. And he nodded in a motion that was almost a bow, which I accepted without granting him absolution, because forgiveness is not an obligation. It is a garden you water when you wish, and some seasons are dry by choice. After the house emptied, I walked its rooms alone, not to gloat, but to listen. And what I heard was not triumph, but relief. The dull hum of a machine finally switched off, the breath of a large animal that had stopped pretending to be a statue. And I opened the windows and let the air pass through, carrying out the old performances and making space for what might be true. And then I met the family I had chosen, a woman with 2 children, and a laugh that came from her belly even when her shoes were tired, and I offered them a fair rent and a promise that I would fix what broke and that I would never ask them to pretend to be anyone's idea of a perfect life. And when the little girl hugged my waist without asking, I felt a stitch loosen that had been pulled tight for decades, and I knew I had placed the house back into the stream of living rather than display. I took for myself a modest apartment 3 streets away, with morning light that arrived like a friend and a porch. I started calling my cathedral because it taught me to look up and forgive the sky for being so patient with us. And I bought a small table at the thrift store and a kettle that sang one clear note. And on the first evening, I cooked my own supper and ate it with both hands, resting on the wood like a woman saying grace without words. And later, I wrote a letter I did not send to my younger self, the girl who believed that love was a ledger, and that if you entered enough good deeds in the margins, you could secure a place at any table. And I told her that love is not a receipt, it is a practice. And that the people who ask you to become invisible are telling you where their eyes end, not where you end. And I folded the letter and slid it behind the old recipe card for sweet potato cake, because some truths rise slowly like batter in a warm oven and are best found when you are looking for something comforting to bake. My grandson wrote again, and this time I answered, not with explanations, which always sound like apologies in disguise, but with an invitation to walk with me on Saturday mornings and to ask me anything at all except permission to be kind. Because kindness is a birthright and not a pass. And when he arrived with a paperback in his back pocket and the familiar crease between his eyes, he did not bring a camera, and he did not look over his shoulder for approval. He only matched my steps and told me he had been afraid to choose gentleness in a house that applauded hardness, and I told him I had been afraid to choose myself in a life that asked me to applaud everyone else, and we understood each other without verdicts. Sometimes we pass the house as we walk, and we see new chalk drawings on the driveway and a pair of muddy shoes on the stoop, and once a crooked paper crown left on the railing, and I feel the rightness of it down to my bones, that my deed did not become a weapon, but a welcome that the walls are learning to hold laughter without flinching. On the day the last document arrived with the final seal, I taped a small card inside my dresser drawer where only I would see it each morning. A line written for every woman who has ever been told to lower her voice or to sit in the garage until the picture is taken and it says that you did not lose them. They set you down and you picked yourself up and you walked out of their frame and into your own. And that is not abandonment. It is arrival. If you are listening to me now in a quiet kitchen with a cup that has gone cold because you are thinking too hard about the ways you have been made small, know that there is no ceremony required for your beginning, only a decision, only a step, only the steady grammar of your name written by your own hand where someone else once scribbled over you. And when you take that step, do not wait for applause. It will only confuse your feet. Instead, listen for your breath returning to you like a faithful bird. And when it lands, open your window. Let it circle the room, and then let it go ahead of you to where you are going. If you need a blessing to start, take mine. Go buy a keychain before you have a key and let it jingle in your pocket like a small bell calling you home. Because the lock will appear the moment you trust that your hands know how to turn it, and if anyone asks where you are going, tell them you are not leaving, you are arriving, and if they laugh, let them, because I promise you this. It is a strange miracle of late life to be mocked for being broke, and to discover that the riches you were saving were not just in bank accounts, but in your refusal to disappear, And when the door opens, as it will, step through and do not look back unless you are waving someone else forward.